Now, furthermore, given the dependence that we've seen on the location of your birth, of what you believe, it means that God has been totally random in assigning some to be damned and some to be saved. You're born over here, you'll be saved. You're born over there, wrong parents, sorry, hard luck, you're damned forever. Now, the point about gratitude is this. Let me tell you a true story. There was a plane crash some years ago, and 20 people, I think it was 50 people were saved and 50 people died. For technical reasons, they interviewed someone who hadn't survived. And that person said, now I know that God exists. What about the other fuckers? Now, I think that there's only two ways in which this person could have thought of it. He could have said, well, I, of course, deserve to be saved by the creator of the universe, the artificer of the Big Bang, pointed to me and said, he deserves. And the others, let's kill those. Right? Well, really, can you condone this? Or maybe it was just totally random. That's called grace in theology. Completely arbitrary. I think the concept of grace is a great concept, actually, because it acknowledges, it's religious people acknowledging that as a matter of fact, everything that matters is deeply random. But then you can hardly say that God cares about fairness. All of this basically amounts to the classic argument from evil. God is omniscient, he knows everything, he is omnibenevolent, he's all good, he is omnipotent, and therefore he can do anything. So why doesn't God prevent evil? As clearly, manifestly, observation shows that he doesn't. Of course, you can tell a story about how it's all going to come out all right in the end, right? But you have to swallow the whole story for that even to make sense. And since there's so much compelling evidence that we will not survive our death, that no one can have a consciousness and experience pleasure or pain once that brain has dissolved into dust or ashes, right? This promised land where everything's going to be all right is clearly just a fairy tale. Finally, I want you to consider the possibility, and I know this is going to be incredibly hard for those of you who believe, but I think quite easy for those who don't, and maybe for some of you who are just on the edge, that you'll be able to see that actually life is a lot better without God. First of all, you can have all the good things that God brings you, as indeed the Greeks, the Chinese, the Indians had all the good things in terms of deathless art, in terms of wonderful literature, brought to them by gods who, as I said at the beginning, didn't need to exist in order to bring them all these goods. Okay? So you can have everything without God. You can have art and use all those gods as metaphors and not just be confined to one. You can pursue mystical states. Mystical states are perfectly intelligible. We can recognize them for states that go with certain conditions of the brain. We can cultivate them by all kinds of techniques, which may include meditation, may include drugs. It doesn't matter. The point is that mystical states in no way require that you should believe in God. Even though, of course, those who believe in God attribute their mystical states to some sort of personal experience of God himself. And above all, not only can you still be a good person and seek justice and fight against cruelty and harmful prejudices without God, but, I submit, you're a lot more likely to. And there's evidence about that as well. For example, the simple evidence, it's very well known, that in the God-fearing states of the United States, these so-called red states, there are a lot more rapes, there are a lot more murders, there are a lot more teenage pregnancies than there are in the so-called blue states, where fewer people believe this stuff. So I will conclude, despite the fact that I still have over 30 seconds in which I could expatiate on some of these things, by suggesting to you that the garden of God is the place where the very fact of wanting knowledge, eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge, is a mortal sin that we've had to pay for ever since, and that God had to torture himself in order to expatiate. What kind of story is that? We're well out of that garden. Thank you.
You'll remember that in my first speech I said I would defend two main contentions in tonight's debate. The first of which was that there's no good reason to think that atheism is true. Now, in his opening speech, Dr. De Sousa, I think, could get a prize for rhetoric if we were competing in that. But it's very difficult to discern exactly his arguments because the premises of his arguments weren't very clearly presented. But I discerned basically 5 arguments in that opening speech against the existence of God. Let me attempt to respond to these as best I can. Number 1, the definition of God entails that he doesn't exist. And here he does a parody of the ontological argument. The ontological argument is an argument that says that as the greatest conceivable being, God would exist in all possible worlds. So that if God's existence is even possible, it follows that he exists in all possible worlds and therefore in the actual world. I think the ontological argument is a sound argument for the existence of God, and so I'm going to add it to the 5 that I've already presented. But what Dr. De Sousa says is, we can parody this by saying there's an even greater God than the God of the ontological argument, namely a God who doesn't exist and who manages to create everything. The problem with that is that a God who doesn't exist is a logical incoherence. It is logically self-contradictory to say there is a being which does not exist. There is no possible world which contains a being that doesn't exist. And therefore this isn't parallel to the ontological argument. It is in fact a logical incoherence which does nothing to show either that the ontological argument is unsound or that God does not exist. Second argument that he suggests seems to be the argument from evil and imperfection in the world. And here I need to correct a misimpression. The theist is not committed to the view that this is the best of all possible worlds. Leibniz may have held that, but almost no other theist believes that. Indeed, the idea of a best of all possible worlds may be a logically incoherent idea. The scale of possible worlds may simply go on without any sort of maximum value. You could always add better things and get better and better, so that God is simply required to create a world that is on balance good. It may be a logical incoherence to talk about a best of all possible worlds. In any case, if Dr. De Sousa is maintaining that there's some sort of a logical contradiction between the propositions God exists and evil and suffering exist, then he bears the burden of proof of showing that contradiction. Those are not explicitly contradictory. If the atheist wants to say they're implicitly contradictory, then he must be assuming some hidden premises that would bring out that contradiction and make it explicit. But no atheist has ever been able to successfully identify what those hidden premises are. So I will simply wait for Dr. Sousa's response. In fact, I can actually prove that those are compatible by adding a third premise, namely, God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil that exists. As long as that's even possible, it shows that God and evil are not logically incompatible. So the atheist would have to show that it is impossible for God to have morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil in the world, and that's an enormous burden of proof that no atheist has ever been able to bear. The third argument that he gives is a cluster of arguments that are united by their common commission of the genetic fallacy. Namely, the argument that religious belief is due to a hyperactive agency detection advice, that God is a comfort, and that where you were born determines what you believe. All of these commit the genetic fallacy, which tries to invalidate a belief by showing how the belief originated. And that, as he knows, is simply a logical fallacy. The fact is, we still have to ask ourselves what justification is there for these beliefs, and that is independent of how the belief came to originate.